The music stopped the moment Elena Voss walked through the double doors, though nobody else in the hall seemed to notice. Only she felt it, that small drop in her chest, the same one she felt every single time she entered a room where Damien Cross stood across from her and refused to look up. 3 years. 3 years of standing near the back wall of the Silver Pine Gathering Hall, watching him laugh with his commanders, watching him nod at elders, watching him do everything except turn his head in her direction. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight she had told herself she would walk in with her shoulders straight and her chin high, and she would not care whether he noticed her at all. She almost believed it, until she saw him standing near the fire pit, golden light moving across his face, and her traitorous heart skipped exactly the way it always did. Mara appeared at her side within seconds, a cup of spiced cider already in hand, pressed into Elena's palm before she could protest. Mara had been doing this for years, showing up exactly when Elena needed a distraction, though tonight, even Mara's easy smile could not fully soften the tightness in Elena's jaw. "You look like you're about to fight someone," Mara whispered, leaning close so only Elena could hear. "I look like I'm surviving," Elena said. "There's a difference." Mara glanced toward the fire pit, toward the tall figure with dark hair and broad shoulders, who commanded the attention of every wolf near him, without even trying. "He hasn't looked over here once," she said, careful, testing the water. "He never does." Elena's voice came out flatter than she intended. 3 years of practice had taught her how to say those words without flinching, though the ache underneath them never really faded, no matter how many times she repeated them to herself in the quiet of her own room. It had not always been like this. There had been one night, 3 years ago, when Damien Cross had looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her before. It was during her very first pack gathering, after transferring from the Ashwood territory. Back when she barely knew anyone's name. Back when the entire pack still felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. She remembered the exact moment their eyes met across the room. The way the air seemed to still. The way her wolf had risen inside her chest, with a recognition so sudden and so complete that she had actually gasped out loud.
"Mate."
The word had settled into her bones before her mind even caught up. Damien had felt it too. She was certain of that, even now, even after everything. She had seen it in the way his eyes had widened, the way his hand had tightened around the cup he was holding, until his knuckles went pale, the way he had taken one step toward her before stopping himself entirely. He never came closer that night. He turned instead, spoke to an advisor about some minor pack matter, and by the time Elena worked up the courage to approach him herself, he had already left the hall. The following morning, word spread through the pack that Alpha Damien Cross was finalizing an alliance with the neighboring Thornridge territory, an alliance that would be sealed, many assumed, through a strategic pairing with their beta's daughter. Nothing was ever confirmed. No formal announcement followed. But Damien never spoke to Elena again after that night, not truly, not in any way that mattered. He would nod if pack business required it. He would address a room she happened to be standing in. But he never sought her out, never acknowledged the bond that had clearly ignited between them, never gave her so much as a private word to explain why he had turned away. 3 years of pack dances came and went. 3 years of Elena standing in corners, watching him from a distance, telling herself that maybe tonight would be the night he finally crossed the room. 3 years of walking home afterward with Mara, replaying every glance that wasn't a glance, every almost moment that led nowhere. Tonight, standing near the fire pit with her cider growing cold in her hand, Elena watched Damien throw his head back in laughter at something one of his commanders said, and something inside her simply closed, like a door being shut gently, but firmly for the very last time. "I'm leaving," she said suddenly. Mara blinked. The dance just started. "I know." Elena set her cup down on a nearby table, her hands steady, despite the storm building underneath her ribs. "I'm not talking about tonight, Mara. I mean, I'm done. I'm done coming to these things and standing here like some kind of ghost, waiting for a man who made his choice a long time ago. I'm done." "Elena." "No, listen to me." Elena turned to face her friend fully now, and something in her expression must have carried real weight, because Mara actually went quiet and waited. "I have given 3 years of my life to hoping, 3 years of dressing up for dances I don't even enjoy, standing against walls, watching him from across rooms, telling myself that eventually he would notice me the way he did that first night. He hasn't. He won't. And I think some part of me has known that for a very long time. But I kept coming anyway, because as long as I kept coming, I could keep hoping. And I'm tired, Mara. I am so tired of hoping for someone who has never once given me a reason to. Mara's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze Elena's hand. You don't have to explain it to me. I've watched you do this for 3 years. I just want to make sure you're doing this for you, not just because you're angry tonight. Elena thought about that for a moment, really thought about it, letting the noise of the hall fade into the background while she searched her own heart for the truth. I'm not angry, she said finally, and she realized as she said it that it was true. I'm just done. There's a difference between anger and simply being finished with something that was never going to change. Across the hall, Damien Cross had no idea that his entire world was about to shift beneath his feet. He stood near the fire pit, half listening to his commander Foster Kane discuss the upcoming Border Patrol schedule, though his attention kept drifting the way it always did during these gatherings, kept drifting toward a particular spot near the back wall where he had trained himself, over 3 long years, to never quite let his eyes land. He was good at it now. He had built an entire discipline around not looking at Elena Voss. He knew, without ever confirming it consciously, exactly where she usually stood, exactly which corner she favored, exactly how long it usually took her to arrive at these gatherings. He knew because some quiet, stubborn part of his mind kept track of her the way a lighthouse keeper tracks the tide. Not because he wanted to, but because some instinct older than his own will simply refuse to let her go unnoticed. He had made a decision 3 years ago, a decision he still told himself was the right one, even on nights like this when doubt crept in through the cracks he worked so hard to seal. The alliance with Thornridge had been fragile back then, the pack's resources stretched thin after a difficult winter, and old Beta Halloway had made it clear, in the careful diplomatic way pack elders always spoke, that a bond between their 2 territories would secure peace and stability for years to come. Damien had been young in his role as Alpha, barely 2 years into leadership, and the weight of every decision had felt like it could break the pack in half if handled poorly. Then Elena Voss had walked into a gathering hall on an ordinary evening, and something inside him had recognized her before his mind even processed what he was seeing. Mate. The word had struck him like lightning, sudden and undeniable, and for one terrifying moment he had almost crossed the room to claim what his wolf was howling at him to claim. But he hadn't, because claiming a mate bond that night would have unraveled every careful diplomatic thread he had spent months weaving, would have insulted an ally, at the exact moment the pack could least afford enemies, would have thrown his people into uncertainty during a season when uncertainty could cost lives. So he had turned away instead, told himself it was duty, told himself the bond would fade if he simply refused to acknowledge it, told himself that being Alpha meant sometimes choosing the pack over his own heart. The alliance with Thornridge had eventually fallen apart anyway, dissolved over some unrelated dispute involving hunting territory less than a year later, long after Damien had already built 3 years of distance between himself and Elena. He told himself it didn't matter by then. Too much time had passed. She had surely moved on. Reopening that door now would only cause confusion, would only stir up old feelings that were better left buried. At least, that was what he told himself, every single time he caught the edge of her scent, drifting across a crowded hall. Every single time his wolf rose sharply inside him, at the sound of her voice from somewhere behind him. Every single time 3 years of discipline nearly cracked wide open. Tonight, standing near the fire pit, he felt something different in the air, though he couldn't quite name it. A kind of stillness, a shift in the usual rhythm of the gathering. He glanced instinctively toward the back wall, toward the corner where his mind had already, without permission, mapped Elena's presence for the evening. She wasn't looking at him. In fact, she was speaking with obvious intensity to her friend Mara, her hands moving as she talked, her whole posture radiating something that looked almost like resolve. He watched her for a moment longer than he meant to, long enough that Foster Kane noticed and followed his gaze. "Something wrong, Alpha?" Foster asked, his tone carefully neutral, in the way that seasoned commanders learned to speak when they suspected they had stumbled into something private. "No," Damien said, too quickly, tearing his eyes away. "Nothing's wrong." But something felt wrong, though he couldn't place it. A low hum of unease, settling beneath his ribs, that had nothing to do with border patrols, or pack finances, or any of the dozen practical matters that usually occupied his mind during these gatherings. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was simply the fire pit smoke catching in his throat, the noise of the hall pressing in louder than usual, the late hour wearing on his patience. He did not know, not yet, that across the room a decision had just been made that would upend the careful equilibrium he had spent 3 years constructing. He did not know that the next pack dance, and everyone after it, would arrive without Elena Voss standing quietly in her corner, without her scent drifting faintly through the crowd, without the small, steady presence he had spent 3 years pretending not to need. He would find out soon enough. And when he did, the absence would teach him something that 3 years of careful distance never could, that some things cannot simply be managed with discipline and duty, that some bonds, once ignored for long enough, do not wait patiently forever for someone to finally decide they are ready. Elena left the gathering hall that night with Mara at her side, walking beneath a sky scattered with stars, the cold air a welcome relief after the crowded warmth of the dance. She did not look back over her shoulder. She did not linger by the doors hoping for one final glance in her direction. For the first time in 3 years, she simply walked away, and something about the simplicity of that act felt more powerful than anything she had done in a very long time. "How do you feel?" Mara asked as they walked, her breath forming small clouds in the night air. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "Lighter," she said finally, and she meant it. "I feel lighter than I have in years." Behind them, the gathering hall glowed warm against the darkness, music and laughter spilling out into the night, and somewhere inside that warm glow stood a man who would not understand, for several more weeks, just how much had changed the moment Elena Voss decided she was finished waiting for him to notice her at all. The walk home stretched longer than usual that night, though neither woman seemed to mind. The streets of Silver Pine territory were quiet at this hour, lined with modest homes and old oak trees, whose branches stretched overhead like protective arms. Elena breathed in the cool night air, and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. A kind of peace that came not from resolution, but from decision, from finally choosing herself over a hope that had never once been reciprocated. "You know," Mara said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "I always wondered when you would finally reach this point. I never doubted you would get here eventually. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Elena." "I don't feel strong," Elena admitted. "I feel like someone who finally got tired of hurting herself the same way over and over again." "That's its own kind of strength," Mara said, recognizing the pattern and choosing to break it. "Most people never manage that. They keep doing the same thing, expecting different results, until the pattern becomes their entire life." Elena thought about that for a long moment, turning the words over in her mind. She thought about the countless pack dances she had attended over the years, always with the same small flicker of hope in her chest, always leaving with that same flicker slightly dimmer than before. She thought about the birthdays and celebrations, and quiet family gatherings, where she had caught herself scanning crowds for a particular face, always disappointed when she found it turned away from her. 3 years was a long time to live inside a pattern like that, long enough that breaking it now felt almost disorienting, like stepping off solid ground onto something unfamiliar. "Do you think he'll notice?" Elena asked quietly, hating herself slightly for even asking the question, hating that some small part of her still cared about the answer. Mara considered this carefully before responding. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man who has spent 3 years training himself not to look at someone has actually spent 3 years very much aware of exactly where that someone is standing. Absence has a way of being louder than presence sometimes, Elena. If he's been keeping track of you all this time without meaning to, he'll notice when there's suddenly nothing left to keep track of." The thought settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, not because she wanted Damien to suffer, but because some old, stubborn part of her still wondered what it might mean if he did notice, if he did feel the absence the way Mara suggested he might. She pushed the thought away almost as quickly as it arrived. She had not made this decision hoping for some dramatic reaction from Damien Cross. She had made this decision because she deserved better than standing in corners hoping to be seen by someone who had already made his choice clear through years of silence. They reached Elena's small cottage at the edge of the residential district, its windows dark, its garden overgrown with the wildflowers Elena had planted the previous spring and never quite found time to tend properly. Mara paused at the gate, studying her friend's face in the moonlight. "For what it's worth," Mara said, "I think you're doing the right thing. Whatever happens next, whether he notices or doesn't, whether he ever explains himself or continues on exactly as he has been, You deserve to stop shrinking yourself down to fit into corners of rooms hoping someone remembers you exist. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, gratitude and exhaustion tangled together into something she didn't quite have words for. "Thank you," she said simply, "for staying with me through all of it. I know it wasn't always easy watching me do this to myself." "That's what friends are for," Mara said, pulling her into a brief, firm hug. "Get some rest. Tomorrow is the beginning of something new, whether you feel ready for it or not." Elena watched Mara disappear down the moonlit street before letting herself into her cottage, the familiar creak of the door welcoming her home. She moved through the dark rooms without bothering to light a lamp, her body remembering the layout well enough to navigate by touch alone. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, staring out the window at the star-scattered sky, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. She had done it. She had actually done it. 3 years of quiet hope, extinguished not with anger or bitterness, but with simple, quiet resolve. Tomorrow there would be no pack dance to prepare for, no careful selection of clothing meant to catch an eye that never turned her way, no walk to the gathering hall with her heart already bracing for disappointment. Tomorrow would simply be a day, ordinary and unremarkable, and somehow that thought brought her more comfort than she had felt in years. Across town, in the grand stone hall that served as both his home and the seat of his leadership, Damien Cross sat alone in his study, long after the pack dance had ended, a glass of untouched whiskey sitting on the desk before him. Foster Kane's earlier question echoed in his mind, refusing to fade the way most passing comments usually did. "Something wrong, Alpha?" He had said no, but the unease that had settled beneath his ribs during the gathering had only grown heavier as the night wore on, and he could not, for the life of him, understand why. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was simply exhaustion, the accumulated weight of pack business and leadership responsibilities finally catching up to him after a long week. He told himself a great many things that night, sitting alone in the quiet of his study, and none of them explained the strange hollow feeling that had settled in his chest the moment he had watched Elena Voss walk out of the gathering hall, without once looking back in his direction. He had watched her leave. He would not admit that to anyone, not even to himself in any conscious way, but some part of his mind had tracked her exit with the same careful, hidden attention it always paid to her presence, and something about the particular quality of her departure that night had struck him as different, though he could not name exactly how. He drained the whiskey in one motion and told himself to stop thinking about it. Tomorrow there would be pack business to attend to, disputes to settle, patrols to schedule. There was no room in his life for dwelling on a woman he had made a clear decision to leave alone 3 years ago. A decision he still believed, mostly, had been the right one. He did not yet know that the next pack dance would arrive without her. He did not yet know how loudly an absence could speak, how much space one missing presence could occupy in a hall full of people. He would find out soon enough, and when he did, 3 years of careful discipline would begin to crack, in ways he never anticipated, revealing something underneath that he had spent a very long time trying to bury. For now, he simply sat alone in his study, turning an empty glass in his hands, unaware that the woman he had spent 3 years pretending not to watch had just made a decision that would eventually force him to confront everything he had been avoiding since the night they first met. The following week passed with a strange kind of quiet that Elena had not expected. She woke each morning without the familiar knot of anticipation that used to build in her stomach as pack dances approached, and by the 3rd day she realized she had stopped counting down to anything at all. Instead, she found herself walking the market square with a lightness in her step, greeting neighbors she had barely noticed before, lingering over conversations she once would have rushed through on her way to somewhere else. It was strange how much space had opened up in her life once she stopped reserving a corner of her heart for a man who never claimed it. She had not planned to skip the next gathering entirely. That decision had crystallized slowly over the following days, each morning bringing a little more clarity than the last. When the evening of the dance finally arrived, Elena sat in her small kitchen, preparing a simple dinner for herself, listening to the distant sound of music drifting faintly from the direction of the gathering hall. She did not feel the familiar pull to change into something nice, did not feel the old anxious flutter of hoping tonight might finally be different. She simply ate her dinner, read a few chapters of the book she had been neglecting for months, and went to bed at a reasonable hour, sleeping more soundly than she had in longer than she could remember. Damien Cross, meanwhile, stood near the same fire pit he always stood near, surrounded by the same commanders and elders who always surrounded him, and found himself utterly unable to concentrate on a single conversation happening around him. His eyes kept drifting toward the back wall, toward the corner that had, for 3 years, always held a particular presence, and each time he found it empty, something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. He told himself she was simply running late. Elena had never once missed a pack dance in 3 years, not even during the worst weeks of winter, when travel through the territory became difficult and dangerous. Surely she would arrive any moment, slipping in through the side doors the way she sometimes did when she wanted to avoid drawing too much attention to her entrance. An hour passed, then another. The music continued. The laughter continued. The pack elders continued their usual rounds of gossip and gentle diplomacy, and still the corner near the back wall remained empty. Damien found himself checking the doors more frequently than any alpha with actual pack business to attend to should have been checking anything, and by the time the gathering began winding down toward midnight, a strange, unfamiliar anxiety had settled deep in his stomach. "Looking for someone, Alpha?" Foster Kane asked, appearing at his side with the particular knowing look he sometimes wore, when he suspected more than he said aloud. "No," Damien said, the lie sitting uncomfortably on his tongue. "Just observing the hall." Foster's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he was wise enough not to press further. He had served under Damien long enough to recognize when a topic was better left alone, even when his curiosity screamed otherwise. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his conversation with one of the younger patrol leaders, leaving Damien alone with his unease. By the time the gathering finally ended, Damien had convinced himself that Elena's absence meant nothing significant. Perhaps she was unwell. Perhaps some family matter had called her attention elsewhere for the evening. Perhaps she had simply grown tired and decided to rest instead of attending a mandatory function that, technically, held no true legal requirement of attendance for pack members outside the leadership circle. There were a dozen reasonable explanations, and he cycled through each of them as he walked the empty corridors of his stone hall toward his private chambers, trying to settle the uneasy feeling that refused to release its grip on his chest. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally arrived, it brought with it dreams he had not allowed himself in years. Dreams of golden firelight, and a woman's laughter carrying across a crowded room. Dreams of a hand, almost reaching for his own, before pulling back at the last moment. He woke before dawn, unsettled and restless, and found himself standing at his window, watching the sun rise over the territory, wondering, for the first time in 3 years, whether the choice he had made that first night had truly been the right one. The days that followed brought no relief from his unease. Pack business continued as always, disputes needing resolution, patrols needing coordination, the endless administrative weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders exactly as it always did. But underneath the familiar rhythm of his responsibilities, something had shifted, some quiet unease that refused to settle no matter how he tried to bury himself in work. He caught himself, more than once, walking past the residential district on routes that made little practical sense for whatever errand he claimed to be running. He caught himself lingering near the market square, during hours when he knew, from 3 years of careful unconscious tracking, that Elena often did her shopping. He never actually saw her during these accidental detours, and each time the disappointment that followed surprised him with its intensity. "You seem distracted lately," Beta Holloway observed one afternoon, several days after the pack dance, as they reviewed territory maps spread across the war room table. The old wolf's eyes carried a shrewdness that had guided the pack through difficult decisions for decades, and Damien had learned long ago not to underestimate what Holloway noticed, even when he said little about it directly. "Just a lot on my mind," Damien said, keeping his eyes fixed on the maps rather than meeting the beta's gaze. Holloway made a non-committal sound, tracing a finger along one of the territory boundaries. "You know, Alpha, in all my years serving this pack, I've noticed that the wolves who claim to have a lot on their minds are usually thinking about one specific thing, not many things at all. Care to share what that one thing might be?" Damien said nothing for a long moment, weighing how much honesty he was willing to offer. "Have you noticed," he said finally, choosing his words with deliberate care, "that Elena Voss wasn't at the last gathering?" Something flickered across Holloway's weathered face, an expression Damien couldn't quite read. "I noticed," the old wolf said simply. "Word around the pack is, she's decided to stop attending the dances altogether. Apparently she told her friend Mara as much, And these things have a way of traveling through a pack faster than official announcements ever do. Damien's chest tightened at the confirmation, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. Did she say why? Holloway studied him for a long moment before answering, his expression carrying the particular patience of someone who had watched countless young leaders wrestle with decisions they weren't ready to examine honestly. I couldn't say for certain, he said, though I imagine 3 years of standing in the same corner of the same hall, waiting for the same man to notice her, and never once receiving so much as a passing glance in return, might eventually wear down even the most patient heart. The words landed like a physical blow, and Damien found himself unable to formulate any kind of response. Holloway watched him absorb the statement, his weathered face softening slightly. I've served this pack a long time, Alpha, Holloway continued, his voice gentler now. I remember the night you met her, 3 years ago. I saw the way you looked at her, before you caught yourself and turned away. I understood, at the time, why you made the choice you made. The alliance with Thornridge mattered, and you were young in your role, carrying more weight than most alphas carry in their first decade of leadership. But that alliance dissolved over a year ago, and you never once revisited the choice you made that night. I've wondered, more than once, whether you were still protecting the pack, or whether you had simply grown comfortable hiding behind duty, as an excuse to avoid something that frightened you. Damien's jaw tightened, old defensive instincts rising quickly to the surface. It's not that simple, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't entirely certain he believed them anymore. Perhaps not, Holloway agreed. But I'd encourage you to examine, honestly, what exactly you're afraid of, before 3 years becomes 10, and the woman who once looked at you like you were the answer to something she'd been searching for her whole life, decides she's found her answer somewhere else entirely. The conversation ended there, Holloway returning his attention to the territory maps, as though nothing significant had passed between them. But Damien found himself unable to focus on the discussion that followed, Holloway's words echoing in his mind long after the meeting concluded. That evening, Damien found himself standing on the balcony outside his private chambers, looking out over the sprawling territory his family had governed for generations, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to fully examine the choice he had made that first night with Elena Voss. He had told himself, for so long, that the decision had been about protecting the pack, about prioritizing duty over instinct, about being the kind of leader who could set aside personal desire for the greater good. But standing there in the cool evening air, he began to wonder whether Holloway was right, whether some deeper fear had been driving his choices all along. Because claiming a mate meant vulnerability. It meant opening himself up to a bond that could not be controlled or managed the way pack business could be managed. It meant trusting someone else with a part of himself he had spent his entire life, as Alpha, keeping carefully guarded. Perhaps the alliance with Thornridge had simply provided a convenient excuse, a socially acceptable reason, to avoid something that had always felt, on some deep instinctual level, far more terrifying than any diplomatic negotiation ever could. He thought about Elena standing in that back corner, night after night, year after year, waiting for a sign he never gave her. He thought about the quiet dignity she had carried through what must have been 3 years of accumulating disappointment, never once making a scene, never once confronting him publicly, simply enduring in silence while he told himself the silence meant nothing. And now she had stopped coming altogether. Now the corner stood empty, and somehow that emptiness had taught him more about what he had lost than 3 years of her steady, patient presence ever had. He did not sleep well that night, his mind cycling through memories he had spent years trying not to revisit, that first meeting, the spark of recognition, the countless gatherings since where he had trained himself to look everywhere except toward her corner of the room. He thought about the conversation with Holloway, about the accusation, gentle but pointed, that he had been hiding behind duty to avoid confronting his own fear. By the time dawn broke over the territory, Damien had reached no clear conclusions, only a growing certainty that something needed to change, though he still had no idea what that change might look like, or whether 3 years of silence could ever truly be undone. The following days brought increasing restlessness. Damien found himself short-tempered during meetings that would normally hold his full attention, his mind wandering toward thoughts he had successfully avoided for years. His commanders noticed the shift in his demeanor, though none dared comment directly, exchanging quiet glances among themselves whenever the Alpha's attention drifted mid-conversation. Foster Kane finally broached the subject during a routine patrol briefing, waiting until the other commanders had filed out of the room before speaking. "Alpha, forgive me for saying so, but you haven't seemed yourself these past several days. Is everything all right?" Damien considered deflecting the question the way he had deflected Holloway's earlier inquiry, but something about Foster's genuine concern made the usual dismissive response feel dishonest. "I've been thinking about a decision I made a long time ago," he said instead, surprising himself with the admission, wondering whether it was the right one. Foster nodded slowly, understanding dawning across his features. He had served alongside Damien long enough to have his own suspicions about what, or rather who, might be occupying his Alpha's thoughts. "For what it's worth," Foster said carefully, "the pack has always respected the difficult decisions you've made in the name of our stability. But I've also learned over the years that some decisions, once you realize they were mistakes, are worth the difficulty of correcting, no matter how much time has passed." The words settled into Damien's chest alongside Holloway's earlier observations, building a kind of quiet momentum he could no longer ignore. He thanked Foster for his honesty and dismissed him from the briefing room, then sat alone for a long while, staring at the territory maps without truly seeing them, his mind instead replaying 3 years of missed opportunities, 3 years of silence that had cost him more than he had ever allowed himself to acknowledge. He thought about seeking Elena out directly, about finally offering the explanation he had owed her since that very first night. But even as the idea took shape in his mind, doubt crept in alongside it. What could he possibly say, after 3 years of silence, that would undo the damage already done? What right did he have to disrupt whatever peace she had apparently found in her decision to stop attending the dances, to stop waiting for a man who had given her every reason to give up hope? Perhaps, he thought, the kindest thing he could do now was simply leave her be, let her continue building whatever new life she had begun constructing in his absence. Perhaps 3 years of silence had already closed a door that could never truly be reopened, no matter how much he had come to regret closing it in the first place. But even as he tried to convince himself of this reasoning, some stubborn part of him refused to accept it as final. The bond between them, dormant as it had been for 3 years, still lived somewhere beneath the surface of his carefully maintained discipline, and he found himself unable to simply let go of the possibility that something might still be salvaged, if only he found the courage to try. He did not act on this realization immediately. Pride and uncertainty held him back for several more days, old habits of caution, warring against the new urgency Holloway's and Foster's words had stirred within him. But the seed had been planted, and with each passing day that Elena remained absent from pack gatherings, that seed grew a little more insistent, until Damien found himself unable to think of much else at all. Elena stood in the healing house early on a bright morning, sorting dried herbs into labeled jars, with a focus that had become second nature to her over the past 2 weeks. She had taken on the new role almost on impulse, walking past the healing house one afternoon and noticing a handwritten notice pinned to the door, announcing that old healer Prescott needed an assistant to help manage the growing demands of pack medical care. Elena had never considered herself particularly skilled with herbal remedies, but something about the opportunity had called to her, a chance to fill her days with purpose rather than the quiet emptiness that had followed her decision to step back from pack social life. To her surprise, she had taken to the work quickly. Healer Prescott, an elderly wolf with kind eyes and a patient teaching style, seemed genuinely pleased with her progress, praising her careful attention to detail and her natural instinct for understanding which remedies suited which ailments. Elena found herself looking forward to each morning, arriving early to help prepare the day's supplies, staying late to learn new techniques from Prescott's decades of accumulated knowledge. "You have a gift for this," Prescott told her one afternoon, watching her carefully measure ingredients for a wound-cleansing salve. "Not everyone has the patience for herbal work. It requires precision, but also intuition, knowing when to trust the recipe and when to adjust based on what the situation actually calls for." Elena smiled at the praise, warmth spreading through her chest at the simple pleasure of being genuinely good at something, of contributing meaningfully to her pack in a way that had nothing to do with waiting for anyone's attention or approval. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't expect to enjoy this as much as I do. Sometimes the best opportunities find us when we're finally ready to notice them," Prescott said, his weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "I've been asking for an assistant for over a year. Strange that you happened to walk past my door at exactly the right moment." Elena thought about that observation later that evening as she walked home through the quiet streets of the residential district. the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the cobblestones. Perhaps Prescott was right. Perhaps she had needed to close one door before she could truly notice another one opening, needed to stop waiting for Damien's attention before she could recognize the other opportunities and connections that had been available to her all along. She had begun noticing other changes too, small but meaningful shifts in how she moved through her days. She found herself laughing more easily, engaging more fully in conversations with neighbors and fellow pack members, who had always been friendly toward her, but whom she had never taken the time to truly know. She joined a small gathering of women who met weekly to share recipes and stories, finding unexpected comfort in their easy camaraderie. She started an evening walking routine along the river path that bordered the eastern edge of the territory, discovering a quiet joy in the simple rhythm of movement and solitude that she had never made time for during the years she had spent orbiting around Hope for Damien's attention. Mara noticed the changes too, commenting on them during one of their regular visits. "You seem different," she observed, watching Elena move confidently around her small kitchen, preparing tea for the two of them, without the distracted, half-present energy that had characterized so much of her behavior over the previous years. Lighter, somehow. Like you've set down something heavy you'd been carrying for a long time. "I think I have," Elena admitted, settling into the chair across from Mara with her own cup of tea. "It's strange how much energy I spent hoping for something that was never going to happen. I didn't even fully realize how much space that hope was taking up until I stopped making room for it." "How does it feel now?" Mara asked. "Really feel, not just the version you tell yourself to sound strong." Elena considered the question seriously, appreciating Mara's insistence on honesty rather than easy reassurance. "Mostly good," she said finally. "There are still moments, sometimes, when old habits try to creep back in. I'll be at the market and catch myself scanning the crowd out of pure instinct, before I remember that I'm not looking for him anymore, that I've chosen not to look for him anymore. Those moments still sting a little. But they're becoming less frequent, and when they happen, I recover faster than I used to. I think that counts as progress." "It absolutely counts as progress," Mara said firmly. "Healing isn't a straight line, Elena. Nobody expects you to wake up one morning completely free of 3 years of feeling. What matters is that you're moving forward, even when the movement feels imperfect." They sat together for a while longer, conversation drifting to lighter topics. Mara's ongoing courtship with a patrol leader named Bennett, the upcoming harvest festival, gossip about various pack members that neither of them took too seriously. It was during this easy, comfortable conversation that a knock sounded at Elena's front door, unexpected and slightly startling given the late hour. Elena rose to answer it, curious who might be visiting at this time of evening. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a wolf she did not immediately recognize, tall and well-built, with sandy hair and an easy, confident smile that suggested someone accustomed to being well-received wherever he went. "Elena Voss?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that marked him as coming from outside the Silver Pine territory. "Yes," Elena said, glancing past him toward the empty street, wondering how he had found his way to her home. "Can I help you with something?" "My name is Kellen Ashford," he said, extending a hand in greeting. "I'm visiting from the Redwood territory, here as part of a delegation discussing trade agreements with your pack elders. I hope you'll forgive the unusual introduction, but I met your healer, Prescott, earlier today, and he mentioned you might be able to help me understand the local herbal remedies your pack favors. My own pack is interested in expanding our medical knowledge exchange, and Prescott spoke very highly of your skill and understanding." Elena blinked, surprised by the unexpected explanation, though something about Kellen's open, friendly demeanor put her instantly at ease. "That's very kind of him to say," she said, "though I'm still quite new to the work myself. I'm not sure I'm the best person to consult." "Prescott seemed to think otherwise," Kellen said, his smile widening slightly. "He mentioned your natural instinct for the work, said you'd grasped concepts in weeks that usually take new assistants months to understand. I'd be grateful for even a small portion of your time, if you're willing." Mara appeared behind Elena in the doorway, curiosity evident on her face as she took in the unexpected visitor. "Well," she said, a teasing note entering her voice, "this is certainly more interesting than discussing the harvest festival." Elena shot her friend a warning look, though she couldn't fully suppress her own small smile at Mara's obvious amusement. "Would you like to come in?" she offered Kellen, gesturing toward the small sitting room behind her. "I can't promise I'll have all the answers you're looking for, but I'm happy to share what I've learned so far." Kellen accepted the invitation graciously, and the three of them spent the next hour in easy conversation, Elena explaining various remedies and their applications, while Kellen listened with genuine attentiveness, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a real interest in understanding the material, rather than simply making polite conversation. Mara eventually excused herself, citing an early morning ahead, though not before shooting Elena a meaningful glance on her way out the door, that Elena chose to ignore entirely. Alone with Kellen, Elena found herself surprised by how comfortable the conversation remained, how easily their discussion flowed from herbal remedies into broader topics, his experiences traveling between territories, her own history growing up in the Ashwood Pack before transferring to Silverpine years earlier. Kellen listened with genuine interest, asked follow-up questions that showed he was truly paying attention rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, and made her laugh more than once with observations about the various diplomatic mishaps he had witnessed during his years serving as part of his pack's trade delegation. "You have an interesting way of looking at things," Elena observed at one point, genuinely curious about this stranger who had appeared at her door under such unusual circumstances. "Most delegates I've met seem far more concerned with formal protocol than with actually understanding the people they're negotiating with." "I've always believed understanding people matters more than understanding protocol," Kellen said. "Protocol can be learned from a book. Understanding people requires actually paying attention to them, taking the time to listen rather than simply waiting for your turn to make your own point. Too many diplomats forget that distinction, in my experience." Elena found herself genuinely charmed by this philosophy, by the easy confidence with which Kellen spoke, by the way he seemed entirely comfortable in his own presence, without any of the careful, guarded distance she had grown accustomed to associating with pack leadership. When he finally rose to leave, thanking her sincerely for her time and knowledge, he paused at the door with a hopeful expression. "Would you be willing to continue this conversation sometime?" he asked. "I'll be in Silverpine territory for at least another 2 weeks, while the trade negotiations continue, and I find myself hoping I might have the chance to speak with you again, if you're amenable." Elena considered the request, surprised by how easily she found herself saying yes, how little hesitation the decision required, compared to the years of careful, anxious calculation she had once devoted to any interaction that might involve Damien Cross. "I'd like that," she said, and found that she meant it entirely. Kellen's smile widened, genuine pleasure evident in his expression. "Wonderful. Perhaps I could take you to dinner tomorrow evening, if your schedule allows." "I'd like that very much," Elena said, and closed the door behind him a few minutes later, with a strange, unfamiliar lightness in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit. It was not the same overwhelming, instinctual pull she had felt the night she first met Damien Cross, nothing so immediate or dramatic, but it was something real, something built on genuine conversation and mutual interest, rather than a fated bond that had brought her nothing but years of quiet heartache. She sat with that thought for a long while that evening, examining it carefully, wondering what it meant that she could feel drawn to someone new, without the accompanying weight of destiny or fate, simply through the ordinary, human experience of enjoying someone's company and wanting more of it. Perhaps, she thought, this was what healthy connection actually felt like, built gradually through genuine interest, rather than ignited instantly through forces beyond her control. Word of Kellen's visit to Elena's home traveled through the pack with the particular speed that gossip always seemed to travel in a community, as tightly knit as Silverpine. By the following afternoon, several of Elena's acquaintances had already approached her with curious questions about the handsome visiting delegate, who had apparently spent an hour in her sitting room the previous evening. Elena found herself surprised by how little the attention bothered her, how easily she deflected the questions with good humor, rather than the anxious embarrassment such gossip might once have provoked. News, inevitably, eventually reached the Stone Hall, where Damien Cross conducted his daily pack business, carried through the casual conversation of servants and advisors, who had no particular reason to suspect the information would land with any special weight. Foster Kane mentioned it almost in passing during a routine briefing, discussing the ongoing trade negotiations with the Redwood delegation. "The delegate, Kellen Ashford, seems to be settling in well," Foster observed, reviewing a report on the negotiations' progress. "Made quite an impression on Healer Prescott's new assistant, apparently." Elena Voss, I believe. Spent an evening at her home discussing herbal remedies, and word is he's taken her to dinner as well. Damien's pen stilled against the parchment he had been reviewing, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Is that so? He said, his voice betraying nothing of the sudden tightness that had gripped his chest at the mention of Elena's name paired with another man's. Seems that way, Foster continued, apparently unaware of the effect his casual comment was having on his alpha. Good for her, honestly. She's a lovely woman, deserves someone who actually notices her. The comment, whether intentional or not, landed with particular sharpness, and Damien found himself unable to fully focus on the remainder of their briefing, his mind circling back repeatedly to the image of Elena, sitting across from some visiting delegate, laughing at his jokes, enjoying his attention in a way she had never received from the man who had spent 3 years failing to offer her anything at all. Dinner with Kellen the following evening took place at a small restaurant near the edge of the market square, a modest establishment known throughout Silverpine for its excellent roasted vegetables and warm, unpretentious atmosphere. Elena had chosen it deliberately, wanting somewhere comfortable rather than the more formal dining halls typically favored by visiting delegates, and Kellen had readily agreed, expressing genuine appreciation for the choice. I've had enough formal dinners this trip to last a lifetime, he admitted, settling into the small wooden chair across from her. Endless courses, careful conversation, designed to avoid any actual substance, everyone performing politeness rather than actually connecting. This is much better. Elena laughed, appreciating his honesty. The pack elders do love their ceremony, she agreed, though I suppose there's a reason for it. Formal occasions require formal behavior, or so I've always been told. There's a difference between formal and false, Kellen said. I don't mind ceremony when it serves a genuine purpose. What I mind is performance for its own sake. Conversations where nobody says what they actually mean, because everyone's too busy managing appearances. The conversation flowed easily from there, touching on a wide range of topics. Kellen's experiences traveling between territories as part of his pack's diplomatic corps, Elena's growing passion for herbal medicine, shared observations about the strange customs and traditions that varied between different wolf packs, despite their fundamental similarities. Elena found herself relaxing more fully with each passing hour, enjoying the easy rhythm of genuine conversation, unburdened by any of the anxious hope or careful self-monitoring that had characterized so much of her social life over the previous years. Can I ask you something personal? Kellen said partway through the meal, his tone gentle enough that Elena didn't feel defensive about the request. You can ask, she said. I reserve the right not to answer. He smiled at that. Fair enough. I've noticed, in the short time I've spent in Silverpine, that people speak of you with a certain careful curiosity, nothing unkind, just an awareness that there's a story there they're not quite telling me. I don't want to pry into anything painful, but I find myself curious about you, and I'd rather ask directly than rely on second-hand gossip. Elena considered how to respond, weighing how much of her history she wanted to share with someone she had only just met, however comfortable their conversation had become. There was someone, she said finally, choosing her words carefully. A long time ago, or what felt like a long time, though really, it's only been 3 years. I thought there might be something between us. I was wrong, or at least, whatever might have existed was never acted upon. I spent a long time hoping it would change. Recently, I decided to stop hoping. Kellen listened without interrupting, his expression carrying genuine attentiveness rather than the awkward discomfort such admissions sometimes provoked. That sounds difficult, he said when she finished. Choosing to stop hoping for something, especially something that mattered to you. That takes real courage, I think, more courage than continuing to hope sometimes does. I hadn't thought about it that way, Elena admitted, surprised by the observation. I mostly just felt tired of waiting, tired of watching myself hope for the same thing over and over, without anything changing. Tired and courageous aren't mutually exclusive, Kellen said. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is admit they're tired, and choose to stop anyway, even when stopping feels harder than continuing would. Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a sense of being genuinely understood that she hadn't quite expected from someone she'd known for such a short time. Thank you, she said simply, for not making this awkward, or trying to fix it, or offering advice I didn't ask for. Just for listening. I find you interesting enough to want to actually know you, Kellen said, his tone carrying a warmth that made Elena's cheeks flush slightly. Not the version of you other people describe, but the actual person sitting across from me. That seemed worth the effort of asking directly rather than assuming. The remainder of their dinner passed in easy, comfortable conversation, and by the time Kellen walked her home through the quiet evening streets, Elena found herself genuinely looking forward to seeing him again. He did not attempt anything beyond a warm, respectful farewell at her door, though the lingering warmth in his eyes suggested his interest extended well beyond simple friendship. "I hope we can do this again soon," he said. "I meant what I said, Elena. I find you genuinely interesting, and I'd like the chance to know you better, if you're willing." "I'd like that too," Elena said, and watched him walk back toward the guest quarters, reserved for visiting delegates with a small, genuine smile on her face. Word of their continued courtship spread through the pack over the following days, carried along the same efficient gossip networks that had first announced Kellen's visit to her home. Elena found herself the subject of considerably more attention than she was accustomed to, curious glances and pointed questions following her through the market square and the healing house alike. She handled the attention with more grace than she might have expected from herself, neither hiding from it nor performing for it, simply continuing her days as she always had, while allowing her budding connection with Kellen to develop at its own natural pace. The attention, inevitably, reached Damien Cross with increasing frequency as the days passed, each mention landing with sharper discomfort than the last. He found himself, despite every effort at self-discipline, unable to stop thinking about the situation, unable to fully focus during meetings, unable to shake the particular restless energy that had taken hold of him since Foster's initial mention of Kellen's visit. He told himself, repeatedly, that his reaction made no sense. He had spent 3 years deliberately avoiding any acknowledgement of whatever bond might exist between himself and Elena. He had no right, logically speaking, to feel any particular way about her spending time with someone else, someone who was apparently treating her with exactly the kind of attention and respect that Damien himself had failed to offer across 3 long years. But logic, he was discovering, held little sway over the increasingly insistent feelings churning beneath his careful discipline. He found himself imagining Elena's dinner with Kellen in unwelcome detail, imagining her laughter, her easy conversation, the warmth she might be offering someone who had known her for mere days, compared to the years Damien himself had spent failing to offer her anything at all. The images provoked a possessive discomfort he had no right to feel, and no idea how to properly process. He raised the matter, eventually, with his mother, Lady Corinne Cross, who still served as an informal advisor to pack leadership, despite having formally stepped back from active governance, following Damien's ascension to Alpha, several years earlier. She had always possessed a particular clarity of insight that Damien valued, even when her observations proved uncomfortable to hear. "You look troubled," she observed, settling into the comfortable sitting room, where they often shared afternoon tea, when Damien's schedule allowed for such visits. "More troubled than usual, and given the general weight you carry as Alpha, that's saying something." Damien considered deflecting, the way he had with Foster and Halloway, but something about his mother's steady, patient presence made honesty feel easier than avoidance. "There's a woman," he admitted. "Elena Voss. I believe you may have heard the name." Lady Corinne's expression softened slightly, a knowing look passing across her features. "I've heard the name," she confirmed. "I remember you mentioning her once, briefly, several years ago, right around the time the Thornridge alliance was being negotiated. You never spoke of her again after that, which I always found curious, given the way you spoke of her that first time." "I made a choice," Damien said, the old justification feeling increasingly hollow even as he offered it. "The alliance mattered. I couldn't afford the distraction of pursuing something that might have jeopardized the pack's stability." "And now?" Lady Corinne asked, her tone gentle but pointed. "The alliance dissolved over a year ago, from what I understand. What choice are you making now, Damien?" He was quiet for a long moment, unable to fully answer the question even to himself. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "She's stopped attending pack gatherings. She's apparently found someone new, a delegate from the Redwood territory. I have no right to feel anything about that, given everything I failed to offer her these past 3 years, but I find myself unable to think of much else." Lady Corinne studied her son carefully, her expression carrying a mixture of sympathy and gentle frustration. "You know," she said, "your father made a similar mistake, many years ago, before you were born. He met your mother's dearest friend first, felt a spark he didn't fully understand, and let fear of complication push him toward a more convenient match instead. It took him nearly 2 years to correct that mistake, and by the time he finally did, he had caused considerable pain to several people, including himself. I've always hoped you might learn from his example rather than repeat it. The revelation startled Damien, though it also, somehow, clarified something he had been struggling to articulate. What did he do? He asked. How did he fix it? He stopped hiding behind reasonable explanations and simply told the truth, Lady Corinne said. He admitted his fear, admitted his mistake, and accepted that correcting it would require humility and courage in equal measure. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without consequence. But he told me, many years later, that the alternative, continuing to hide behind convenient excuses, would have cost him far more than the discomfort of admitting he'd been wrong. Damien sat with his mother's words for a long while after their conversation ended, turning them over in his mind as he walked the familiar corridors of the stone hall back toward his private chambers. He thought about Elena, about the 3 years of silence he had constructed between them, about the growing possibility that she had finally, genuinely, moved on to someone who offered her exactly the kind of open, attentive care he had withheld for so long. He thought, too, about his own fear, the fear Holloway had named weeks earlier, the fear his mother's story had only confirmed. He had spent 3 years telling himself his silence was about duty, about protecting the pack, about prioritizing responsibility over personal desire. But standing now in the quiet of his private chambers, staring out at the darkening territory beyond his window, he finally allowed himself to admit what he had been avoiding for far too long. He had been afraid. Afraid of vulnerability, afraid of a bond he couldn't control, afraid of what it might mean to open himself fully to another person after years of building his identity around careful, guarded leadership. The admission brought no immediate relief, only a growing, uncomfortable clarity about how much he had cost himself and Elena, both through years of avoidance. He did not know, yet, what he intended to do with this new understanding, but for the first time in 3 years, he found himself genuinely questioning whether continuing his silence was truly the safer choice, or whether it had simply become the more familiar one, comfortable in its familiarity, despite the growing cost of maintaining it. 2 weeks passed, and Elena's connection with Kellen continued to deepen through a steady rhythm of shared meals, long walks along the river path, and evenings spent in easy conversation that left her feeling more understood than she had in years. He remained in Silver Pine longer than his original delegation schedule required, citing extended trade negotiations as the official reason, though the knowing looks exchanged among pack elders suggested most people understood the real motivation behind his continued presence. Elena found herself genuinely happy during those 2 weeks, happier than she had felt in longer than she could easily remember. Her work at the healing house continued to flourish under Prescott's patient guidance. Her friendship with Mara remained a steady source of comfort and honesty, and her growing relationship with Kellen offered something she had never quite experienced with Damien, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being genuinely pursued by someone who made no secret of his interest. He asked me to consider visiting Redwood Territory sometime, Elena told Mara one afternoon, as they sat together in Elena's small garden, tending to the wildflowers that had finally received the attention they deserved. Nothing formal, just an invitation to see where he grew up, meet some of his family. That's a significant step, Mara observed, carefully avoiding any judgment in her tone. How do you feel about it? Elena considered the question honestly, pulling a stray weed from among the flower beds as she thought. Nervous, but in a good way, she said finally. Not the anxious kind of nervous I used to feel waiting for Damien to notice me. This feels different. Exciting, maybe, rather than fearful. I'm glad, Mara said, and meant it fully. You deserve exciting rather than fearful, Elena. You deserve someone who makes you feel that way consistently, not just in the good moments. Elena smiled, grateful for her friend's genuine support. I haven't decided yet whether I'll actually visit, she admitted. It's a significant commitment, traveling to another territory, meeting his family, but I appreciate that he asked, that he wants me to be part of that side of his life. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone approaching the garden gate, and both women looked up to see a familiar figure standing uncertainly at the entrance to Elena's property. Damien Cross stood there, dressed more casually than Elena had ever seen him at pack gatherings, his usual composed confidence noticeably absent from his posture. Elena felt her breath catch slightly, an old, familiar reaction she had thought herself mostly free of by now. Mara glanced between the two of them, quickly gathering her gardening tools with the tactful efficiency of someone recognizing when her presence had become unnecessary. "I should get going," Mara said, offering Elena a quick, meaningful look before making her way toward the gate, nodding politely to Damien as she passed him on her way out. "I'll see you tomorrow, Elena." Elena rose slowly from where she had been kneeling among the flower beds, brushing dirt from her hands as she studied Damien's uncertain expression. 3 years of watching him from across crowded halls had taught her every nuance of his usual composed bearing, and the visible discomfort he now displayed struck her as genuinely unfamiliar. "Alpha Cross," she said, keeping her tone carefully neutral, refusing to let old habits of anxious deference creep back into her voice. "This is unexpected." "Elena," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, softer and more uncertain than she had ever heard from him, sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest that she quickly worked to suppress. "I wondered if I might speak with you, if you have a few minutes." Elena considered refusing, considered telling him she had no interest in whatever conversation he had finally decided, after 3 years of silence, he wanted to have. But curiosity, and perhaps some lingering, stubborn part of her heart that had never fully released its old hope, kept her from turning him away entirely. "I have a few minutes," she said finally, gesturing toward the small bench positioned beneath the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of her garden. "Though I'll admit, I'm curious what prompted this visit, after 3 years of very little conversation between us." Damien winced slightly at the observation, though he didn't argue with its accuracy. He followed her to the bench, settling beside her with careful distance between them, his hands clasped together in a posture that suggested genuine nervousness rather than the confident authority he usually carried. "I heard you've stopped attending pack gatherings," he said finally, after a long moment of silence. "I wanted to understand why." Elena studied him for a long moment before responding, weighing how honest she wanted to be. "You already know why," she said finally. "You've known why for 3 years, even if you've never acknowledged it directly. I got tired of attending events hoping to finally receive some acknowledgement from you, and never receiving it. Eventually I realized that hope was costing me more than it was giving me, so I stopped." The directness of her answer seemed to land heavily, Damien's expression shifting through something complicated, guilt and regret and old, buried grief all tangled together. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "One I should have offered 3 years ago, instead of letting 3 years of silence speak in my place." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said, though her voice carried less certainty than she wanted it to. "You made your choice a long time ago, Damien. I've made peace with it." "Have you?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity she hadn't experienced from him in years. "Because I haven't. I've spent 3 years telling myself I made the right choice, prioritizing duty and pack stability over instinct. And these past 2 weeks, watching you build something new, with someone who clearly appreciates you far better than I ever managed to, I've realized how thoroughly I was lying to myself." Elena's chest tightened at the admission, old hope and new resolve warring uncomfortably within her. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "After 3 years, after Kellen, after everything?" "Because I was afraid," Damien said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Not of the alliance falling apart, not really, though that was the excuse I told myself and everyone else. I was afraid of the bond itself, of what it would mean to open myself fully to someone else, to trust someone with the part of myself I've always kept carefully guarded as alpha. It was easier to hide behind duty than to admit that fear, even to myself." The honesty in his voice struck Elena more deeply than she wanted to admit, old wounds and new caution tangling together as she tried to process what he was offering her. "That's a significant admission," she said carefully. "But Damien, admissions 3 years late don't undo 3 years of silence. I spent years hoping you would say something like this, and you never did. Now that I've finally stopped hoping, finally started building a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for your attention, you choose to say it." "I know the timing is unfair," Damien said. "I know I have no right to expect anything from you after everything I failed to offer. I'm not here asking you to abandon whatever you're building with Kellen, or to forgive 3 years of silence in a single conversation. I just needed you to know the truth, finally, even if it changes nothing between us now. Elena sat with his words for a long moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the oak leaves above them, the quiet garden holding space for the weight of everything passing between them. Part of her wanted to reach for the old hope, wanted to believe that his admission might finally offer the resolution she had spent 3 years longing for. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger and more certain over the past several weeks of building a life independent of his attention, refused to simply collapse back into old patterns at the first sign of acknowledgement. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said finally, choosing her words with careful deliberation. "I mean that genuinely. But Damien, I can't simply undo 3 years of learning to live without your attention, just because you've finally decided to offer some. I need time to think about what this means, if it means anything at all going forward." Damien nodded slowly, disappointment evident in his expression, though he made no attempt to argue or pressure her further. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair, honestly. I don't expect anything from you, Elena. I just needed you to know, whatever happens next, that my silence was never about you lacking value. It was about my own fear, and that fear was always mine to overcome, not yours to wait out." He rose from the bench, offering her a final, searching look before turning to leave. Elena watched him walk back toward the garden gate, an unfamiliar tangle of emotions settling in her chest, old hope and new caution, and genuine confusion about what this unexpected conversation might mean for the careful, independent life she had spent weeks building. She did not call after him. She did not chase him toward the gate, demanding more answers or offering immediate forgiveness. She simply sat beneath the old oak tree, watching him disappear down the quiet street, and allowed herself to feel the full complexity of what had just passed between them, without rushing toward any easy resolution in either direction. That evening, she found herself unable to fully concentrate on her usual routine, Damien's words echoing through her mind, alongside memories of the past 3 years, alongside her growing feelings for Kellen, alongside the independent life she had worked hard to build in the weeks since she stopped attending pack dances. She did not know, yet, what she wanted to do with the truth Damien had finally offered her, but she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever decision she eventually made would be hers alone, chosen deliberately rather than fallen into, out of old habit or lingering hope. The days following Damien's visit to her garden passed with a strange, unsettled quality that Elena found difficult to shake. She continued her work at the healing house with Prescott, continued her walks along the river path, continued the steady development of her connection with Kellen, but underneath the familiar rhythm of her routine, something had shifted, some careful equilibrium disrupted by the weight of Damien's belated honesty. She found herself, more than once, replaying their conversation in the garden, examining each word for meaning she might have missed in the moment. He had admitted fear, had finally offered the explanation she had waited 3 years to hear, had acknowledged that his silence had never reflected her own worth or value. The admission mattered, she recognized, even if it arrived far later than it should have. But mattering and changing everything were not the same thing, and Elena found herself genuinely uncertain how much weight his words should carry against the independent life she had spent weeks carefully constructing. Kellen noticed her distraction during their next dinner together, his usual attentiveness picking up on the subtle shift in her demeanor, despite her efforts to maintain her usual warmth toward him. "You seem preoccupied tonight," he observed gently, reaching across the table to briefly touch her hand. "Is everything all right?" Elena considered how much to share, weighing honesty against the awkwardness of discussing her complicated history with Damien, while sitting across from someone whose growing affection she genuinely valued. But something about Kellen's consistent honesty with her, throughout their courtship, made deflection feel unfair, a betrayal of the openness that had characterized their connection from the beginning. "Damien Cross came to see me a few days ago," she admitted finally. "He offered an explanation, finally, for 3 years of silence, told me he was afraid, admitted the alliance excuse was never the full truth." Kellen's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena could see him processing the information, with visible effort at fairness. "How do you feel about that?" he asked, his voice steady despite what must have been complicated feelings of his own. "Confused, mostly," Elena admitted. "Part of me feels vindicated, finally hearing the acknowledgement I waited years for. But another part of me feels like the timing makes the admission almost meaningless. I spent 3 years hoping for exactly what he finally offered, And now that I've built a life that doesn't depend on his attention, the offer feels like it belongs to a different version of myself, one who doesn't quite exist anymore." Kellen was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words with care. "I won't pretend I'm not concerned about what this might mean for us," he said finally. "I've grown to genuinely care for you these past weeks, Elena, more than I expected to when I first arrived in Silver Pine. But I also think you deserve the space to sort through your own feelings honestly, rather than making a decision based on what might be easiest or most convenient for me." The generosity of his response struck Elena deeply, further evidence of exactly the kind of open, considerate care she had found so refreshing throughout their courtship. "Thank you for that," she said sincerely. "I don't have answers yet, Kellen. I genuinely don't know what I want to do with what Damien told me. But I promise I won't keep you waiting indefinitely while I figure it out. You deserve better than that." "Take whatever time you need," Kellen said. "I'd rather have an honest, considered answer eventually than a hasty one now that we might both come to regret." Their dinner continued with somewhat subdued energy, though Kellen's genuine kindness throughout the remainder of the evening only deepened Elena's appreciation for what he offered her. Consistent attentiveness, honest communication, a willingness to prioritize her well-being, even when doing so might work against his own interests. She walked home that evening, turning over the comparison between the two men in her mind, unable to fully settle on what the comparison meant for her own path forward. Meanwhile, Damien found himself increasingly restless in the days following his conversation with Elena, uncertain whether his admission had accomplished anything meaningful or simply added additional complexity to an already difficult situation. He had not expected immediate resolution, had told himself, honestly, that he deserved no such thing after 3 years of silence. But the uncertainty that followed his visit to her garden proved more difficult to bear than he had anticipated. Old patience wearing thin against newly awakened hope he had spent years suppressing. He sought counsel again from Beta Halloway, finding the old wolf in his usual afternoon spot near the Eastern Gardens, tending to a small collection of medicinal plants he cultivated as a personal hobby, separate from his official pack duties. "I told her the truth," Damien said, settling onto a nearby bench as Halloway continued his careful pruning work. "Admitted my fear. Admitted the alliance was never the full explanation." "How did she respond?" Halloway asked, not looking up from his plants, though his attention was clearly fully engaged, despite his casual posture. "She said she needed time to think," Damien said, "which is more than fair, given everything. But I find myself struggling with the waiting." Halloway. 3 years of silence felt manageable, because I had convinced myself it was the right choice. Now that I've admitted it wasn't, the uncertainty feels considerably harder to bear. Halloway finally looked up from his plants, studying Damien with the particular patient wisdom that had guided the pack through countless difficult transitions over the decades. "That's often how these things work," he observed. "Denial provides its own kind of comfort, even when it's costing you something valuable. Once you finally acknowledge the truth, the discomfort of uncertainty can feel considerably sharper by comparison, precisely because you no longer have the shield of denial to hide behind." "What should I do?" Damien asked, genuine uncertainty evident in his voice, a vulnerability he rarely displayed, even to his most trusted advisors. "I can't tell you what to do," Halloway said. "That's not my role, and frankly, I don't think it would serve you well even if I tried. But I can tell you what I've observed over many decades of watching leaders navigate difficult personal decisions. The ones who find peace, eventually, are the ones who accept that they cannot control another person's response to their honesty. You've done the difficult work of acknowledging your fear and offering the truth. What Elena chooses to do with that truth is entirely her own decision to make, in her own time. Respecting that, rather than pushing for a faster resolution that serves your own discomfort with uncertainty, is probably the most meaningful thing you can offer her now." Damien absorbed this advice slowly, recognizing its wisdom, even as it offered little immediate relief from his restless uncertainty. "And if she chooses Kellen?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been circling his thoughts since his conversation with Elena in her garden. "If my admission came too late to matter, then you'll have to accept that consequence with grace," Halloway said simply. "You made a choice 3 years ago, Damien, and choices carry consequences whether or not we're prepared to accept them. If Elena chooses a life with someone else, that choice will reflect years of accumulated experience, not a single conversation in a garden. You can't undo 3 years with one honest admission," However genuine that admission might be, all you can do now is let her know the truth, and then respect whatever she decides to do with it, without trying to manipulate the outcome through pressure or manufactured urgency. The conversation offered Damien little comfort, though its honesty proved valuable in a different way, helping him accept the genuine uncertainty of his situation, rather than continuing to search for some guaranteed path toward the resolution he hoped for. He returned to his pack duties with renewed focus, channeling his restless energy into the practical work of leadership, while allowing Elena the space and time she had requested to sort through her own complicated feelings. The following week brought the pack's annual Harvest Festival, a significant celebration that traditionally drew attendance from nearly every member of the Silver Pine territory, including those who had grown increasingly reclusive in recent months. Elena found herself facing a decision about whether to attend, weighing her general reluctance to participate in large pack gatherings against the genuine appeal of the Harvest Festival's warm, communal atmosphere, distinct in character from the more formal pack dances she had deliberately stopped attending. She discussed the decision with Mara during one of their regular visits, turning the question over carefully. The Harvest Festival isn't really like the dances, she reasoned aloud. It's less formal, more about community and gratitude, than the particular social dynamics that made the dances so difficult for me. Are you worried about seeing Damien there? Mara asked directly, always willing to name the underlying concern, rather than letting Elena talk around it indefinitely. A little, Elena admitted, though I think, honestly, I've reached a point where seeing him doesn't destabilize me the way it used to. I'm curious to test that theory, if I'm being fully honest with myself. And Kellen? Mara asked. Will he be attending? He's mentioned wanting to see the festival before his delegation concludes their business in Silver Pine, Elena said. I imagine he'll be there. Mara considered this information carefully. That could make for an interesting evening, she said, her tone carrying gentle amusement despite the genuine complexity of the situation. Two men who both clearly care for you, in the same space, at the same festival. How do you feel about that possibility? Elena thought about the question seriously before answering. Nervous, she admitted, but also, strangely, ready. I think I've spent enough weeks sitting with uncertainty, that I'm ready to see what happens when all the pieces of this situation actually occupy the same space at the same time, rather than existing separately, in my careful compartmentalized thoughts. Mara smiled at this, genuine warmth in her expression. That sounds like real growth, Elena. Whatever happens at the festival, I'm proud of how far you've come these past several weeks. Elena decided, in the end, to attend the Harvest Festival, telling herself she was ready to face whatever complicated dynamics might unfold, ready to trust her own judgment and instincts, rather than continuing to hide from situations simply because they carried emotional complexity. She spent the days leading up to the festival in a state of cautious anticipation, aware that the celebration would likely mark some kind of turning point in the tangled situation between herself, Damien, and Kellen, though she could not yet predict exactly what shape that turning point might take. The Harvest Festival arrived on a crisp autumn evening, the entire Silver Pine territory, transformed by strings of warm lanterns, hung between the old oak trees lining the central square, tables laden with the season's bounty, arranged beneath colorful canopies, and the sound of fiddle music drifting through air, scented with roasted chestnuts and mulled cider. Elena arrived with Mara at her side, dressed in a warm russet-colored dress that matched the season's palette, feeling a genuine excitement that surprised her given the anxious uncertainty that had characterized her decision to attend. The festival's atmosphere felt entirely different from the formal pack dances she had deliberately avoided, communal tables encouraging mingling, rather than the careful social hierarchies that usually governed more formal gatherings. Children running between the legs of adults engaged in easy conversation, elderly pack members sharing stories from harvests decades past. Elena found herself relaxing quickly into the warm, unpretentious energy of the celebration, greeting neighbors and friends with genuine pleasure, rather than the careful social calculation that had once accompanied her every pack interaction. She spotted Kellen near one of the food tables shortly after arriving, his sandy hair catching the lantern light as he laughed at something one of the pack elders had said. He noticed her almost immediately, his face brightening with genuine pleasure as he made his way toward her through the crowd. "You came," he said, warmth evident in his voice as he reached her side. "I wasn't certain you would, given everything." "I wanted to," Elena said, and meant it fully. This felt different from the dances, easier to face, somehow. Kellen offered his arm, and Elena accepted it, allowing him to guide her toward the food tables as they caught up on the small details of their respective days, the easy, comfortable rhythm of their conversation, resuming, as though no complicated uncertainty hung between them. For a while, Elena allowed herself to simply enjoy the festival, the warm cider, the music, Kellen's genuine attentiveness, without dwelling too heavily on the complicated situation with Damien that still remained unresolved. But the peace could only last so long. Elena spotted Damien across the square perhaps an hour into the festival, standing near the ceremonial bonfire, alongside several pack elders, his usual composed authority evident despite the informal setting. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable, before Damien deliberately looked away, apparently determined to give her the space she had requested. She appreciated the restraint, recognizing it as evidence of his genuine effort to respect her boundaries, rather than continuing to press for resolution before she felt ready to offer one. But the brief eye contact had stirred something in her chest regardless, old feelings and new caution tangling together, in a way that made the remainder of the evening feel considerably more complicated than the easy comfort she had enjoyed with Kellen just moments before. The evening progressed with traditional harvest festival activities, a ceremonial blessing of the season's crops, led by the pack elders, communal dancing around the bonfire that felt entirely different in character from the formal dances Elena had avoided, games and competitions that drew enthusiastic participation from pack members of all ages. Elena found herself pulled into the festivities more fully than she had expected, laughing genuinely as she and Mara competed in a friendly apple-bobbing contest, cheering alongside Kellen as the younger pack members raced through an obstacle course set up near the eastern edge of the square. It was during a quieter moment, while Kellen had stepped away to speak with a fellow delegate about ongoing trade negotiations, that Damien finally approached her, his expression carrying the same careful uncertainty she had noticed during his visit to her garden weeks earlier. "I don't want to intrude," he said, keeping respectful distance between them despite the obvious pull she could sense in his posture. "I just wanted to say that you look happy tonight. Genuinely happy. In a way I haven't seen in a long time. I'm glad, Elena. Even if that gladness comes with its own complicated feelings." Elena studied him for a long moment, appreciating the genuine sentiment behind his words, even as she recognized the vulnerability it required for him to offer them. "Thank you," she said finally. "I am happy tonight. This festival feels different from the dances, easier somehow, less weighted with expectation." "I've noticed," Damien said, a small, rueful smile touching his lips. "I've spent 3 years associating pack gatherings with a particular kind of careful discipline, watching everywhere except where I actually wanted to look. Tonight I find myself simply watching you enjoy yourself, without the old fear driving me to look away. It's a strange feeling, honestly. Uncomfortable in some ways, but also clarifying." Elena felt something soften in her chest, despite her efforts to maintain careful emotional distance. "What does the clarity tell you?" she asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Damien considered the question seriously before responding. "That I don't want to keep looking away," he said finally. "That whatever happens with your decision, whatever you choose between myself and Kellen, or perhaps neither of us, I don't want to return to the old pattern of pretending you don't exist, in rooms we both occupy. You deserve better than that, and honestly, I think I deserve better than continuing to live inside that kind of fear." The honesty of his admission struck Elena deeply, and she found herself, for the first time since their conversation in her garden, genuinely uncertain about the path forward. Old hope and new independence, and growing affection for Kellen, all tangling together, in a complicated knot she couldn't easily untangle in the moment. "I still need more time," she said finally, honestly. "I know that's difficult to hear, especially after everything you've finally admitted, but I can't make this decision hastily. Not when it carries this much weight for everyone involved, including myself." "I understand," Damien said, and something in his tone suggested he genuinely meant it, rather than simply offering polite acceptance while secretly hoping to pressure her toward faster resolution. "Take whatever time you need, Elena. I'll be here, whenever you're ready to talk further, if you choose to talk further at all, but I won't push you toward a decision before you're genuinely ready to make it." He offered her a final, warm smile before returning to his position near the elders overseeing the festival, leaving Elena standing alone near the edge of the bonfire's warm glow, processing the complicated tangle of emotions his words had stirred within her. She remained there for several minutes, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky, before Mara found her, offering a cup of warm cider and a knowing, sympathetic look. That looked like an important conversation, Mara observed, settling beside her friend near the bonfire's warmth. It was, Elena admitted. He said he doesn't want to keep looking away from me anymore, regardless of what I decide. It felt genuine, Mara. More genuine than anything he's offered me in 3 years. How do you feel about that? Mara asked, echoing the question she had posed so many times over the past several weeks. Elena considered the question carefully, watching the bonfire's flames cast dancing shadows across the gathered crowd. Confused, she admitted, but also, strangely, more settled than I expected to feel. I think I finally understand that whatever I decide, I'll be choosing it because it's genuinely right for me, not because I'm still trapped inside old hope or old fear. That feels like real progress, even if I still don't have a final answer. The remainder of the festival passed in a blur of warm conversation, music, and communal celebration, Elena moving between moments with Kellen and quiet observation of Damien across the square, each interaction adding another layer of clarity to the complicated decision still awaiting her. By the time the festival concluded, the bonfire burning low, as pack members began drifting home through the cool autumn night, Elena felt no closer to a final decision, but considerably more certain that whatever she eventually chose would be a decision made from genuine strength, rather than old patterns of hope or fear. She walked home that night beneath a sky brilliant with stars, turning over the events of the evening in her mind, aware that some kind of resolution was approaching, even if she could not yet fully predict its shape. The days following the Harvest Festival brought a growing sense of urgency to Elena's situation, as Kellen's delegation prepared to conclude their trade negotiations and return to the Redwood territory within the coming weeks. He raised the subject directly during one of their evening walks along the river path, the autumn air carrying a noticeable chill that hinted at the approaching winter. The negotiations are nearly finished, he said, his tone carrying a careful gentleness that suggested he had been considering how to broach the subject for some time. I'll need to return to Redwood territory within the next 2 weeks. I would very much like you to consider coming with me, Elena, not just for a visit, but as something more permanent, if you're willing to consider such a significant step. Elena felt the weight of the request settle heavily in her chest, appreciating the genuine sincerity behind it, while also recognizing the magnitude of what he was asking. That's a significant commitment, she said carefully, leaving my pack, my home, everything I've built here, to start a new life in unfamiliar territory. I know it's significant, Kellen said. I wouldn't ask if I didn't genuinely believe we could build something meaningful together, but I also understand if the timing feels wrong, given everything else you're navigating right now. I don't want to pressure you into a decision before you're ready, Elena. I just needed you to know the timeline we're working with, so you can factor it into whatever you decide. Elena appreciated his honesty, recognizing the genuine care behind his willingness to be direct about the practical constraints of their situation, rather than leaving her to guess at unspoken expectations. I need to think carefully about this, she said. About all of it, honestly. I promise I'll have an answer for you before your delegation departs, one way or another. That's all I ask, Kellen said, squeezing her hand gently as they continued their walk along the darkening river path. The conversation weighed heavily on Elena's mind over the following days, forcing her to confront the reality that her complicated situation could not continue indefinitely, that some decision, one way or another, would need to be made within the coming weeks. She found herself seeking out Prescott's counsel one quiet afternoon at the healing house, trusting the old healer's characteristic wisdom, despite the personal nature of the question weighing on her. You seem troubled today, Prescott observed, watching her measure herbs with less than her usual careful precision. I have a significant decision to make, Elena admitted, setting down the mortar and pestle she had been using. Kellen has asked me to return with him to Redwood territory, and Damien has finally admitted feelings he spent 3 years denying. I don't know which path forward is right for me, and I'm running out of time to decide. Prescott considered this for a long moment, his weathered face carrying the particular thoughtful expression he usually reserved for complicated medical cases requiring careful diagnosis. "May I offer an observation?" he asked. "Not advice, exactly, just an observation, from someone who has watched you grow considerably these past several weeks." "Please," Elena said, genuinely curious what perspective he might offer. "You've spent 3 years defining your worth by whether Damian Cross chose to acknowledge you," Prescott said. "These past several weeks, you've built something entirely different, a life defined by your own choices, your own growth, your own genuine happiness, independent of anyone else's attention. I've watched you become remarkably skilled at this work, watched you develop genuine friendships, watched you discover confidence I don't think you knew you possessed. Whatever decision you make now, about Kellen or about Damian, I hope you make it from that place of independent strength, rather than allowing either man's attention to become the new foundation for your sense of worth." Elena absorbed his words carefully, recognizing their wisdom, even as they offered no easy resolution to her immediate decision. "How do I know which choice reflects genuine strength, rather than old patterns reasserting themselves in new forms?" she asked. "I think you'll know," Prescott said, "if you ask yourself honestly, whether you're choosing a path because it genuinely serves your own growth and happiness, or because it offers validation you're still secretly seeking from someone else's attention. Kellen offers you genuine partnership, built on real conversation and mutual respect. Damian offers you the resolution of old hope, finally acknowledged after years of painful waiting. But only you can determine which one truly serves the person you've become these past several weeks, rather than the person you used to be." Elena left the healing house that afternoon with much to consider, Prescott's words settling alongside everything else weighing on her mind as she walked home through the crisp autumn air. She found herself, over the following days, engaging in careful, honest self-reflection, examining her feelings for both men, with the kind of clear-eyed honesty she had spent weeks developing through her independent growth. Her feelings for Kellen, she recognized, were genuine and substantial, built on real conversation, consistent attentiveness, and a partnership that felt equal and mutually respectful, in ways her old dynamic with Damian never had been. But when she examined those feelings honestly, she also recognized something missing, some deeper resonance that, however painful its history, had always existed between herself and Damian from that very first meeting 3 years earlier. It was not a resonance she could logically explain or fully justify, given everything that had happened since. But it existed nonetheless, undeniable despite 3 years of accumulated hurt. Her feelings for Damian, meanwhile, carried a complexity that resisted easy categorization. The old hope remained, she recognized, however much she had tried to release it these past several weeks. But alongside that hope existed genuine, well-earned caution, awareness that his 3 years of silence reflected a real pattern of fear and avoidance, that his recent admissions, however genuine, had not yet been fully tested against real circumstances. Words offered in a garden or across a bonfire were one thing. Whether Damian could truly sustain the vulnerability he had finally admitted, over the long term, through the genuine difficulty of real partnership, remained an open question she had no way of answering with certainty. She discussed these complicated reflections with Mara during one of their regular visits, appreciating her friend's continued willingness to listen, without judgment or premature advice. "I think," Elena said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke them aloud, "that I need to talk with Damian directly, one more time, before I can make a final decision. Not to give him another chance exactly, but to understand more fully whether his recent admissions reflect genuine, sustainable change, or simply a momentary reaction to the possibility of losing me to someone else." "That seems wise," Mara said. "How do you plan to approach that conversation?" "Honestly," Elena said, "the same way I've tried to approach everything these past several weeks. I'll ask him directly what he's actually prepared to offer, going forward. Not just words, but genuine commitment. And I'll trust my own judgment about whether his answer reflects real change, or simply convenient timing." Mara nodded, clearly proud of the clarity and confidence Elena had developed through her weeks of independent growth. "Whatever you decide, Elena, I trust you to make the right choice for yourself. You've earned that trust these past several weeks, through everything you've built and everything you've learned about your own strength." Elena thanked her friend for her continued support before turning her thoughts toward the difficult conversation ahead, aware that whatever Damien offered in response would likely determine the final shape of the decision she needed to make before Kellen's delegation departed Silverpine territory within the coming days. Elena sent word to Damien, requesting a meeting, choosing neutral ground rather than either her home or the stone hall, settling instead on a quiet clearing near the eastern gardens, where Halloway often tended his medicinal plants. Damien arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his expression carrying a careful mixture of hope and apprehension that Elena recognized as genuine rather than performed for her benefit. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling onto a stone bench positioned beneath a canopy of autumn-colored leaves. "I have some questions I need answered honestly, before I can make a decision about how to move forward, with you, or with Kellen, or with neither of you." "Ask whatever you need to ask," Damien said, settling beside her with careful, respectful distance. "I'll answer as honestly as I can." Elena took a steadying breath before beginning. 3 years ago, you chose duty over instinct, told yourself the alliance mattered more than acknowledging what existed between us. What happens the next time duty and instinct conflict? How do I know you won't make the same choice again, whenever circumstances present another convenient excuse for retreat? Damien considered the question with visible seriousness, clearly recognizing its importance, rather than offering a hasty, reassuring answer. "I can't promise I'll never face fear again," he said finally. "I can't promise leadership won't sometimes require difficult choices that feel like they're pulling me away from personal desire. But I can promise this. I've spent 3 years hiding behind duty as an excuse to avoid vulnerability, and these past several weeks have taught me how much that avoidance actually cost me, cost us both. I don't ever want to make that mistake again, not because I can guarantee perfect courage in every future circumstance, but because I've finally understood the real price of choosing fear over honesty, and that price is too high for me to willingly pay again." Elena studied his expression carefully, searching for any sign of performance or convenient rationalization, finding instead what appeared to be genuine, hard-won understanding. "What would it actually look like," she asked, "if I chose to give you another chance? Not in vague terms, but specifically. What would you actually do differently?" "I would tell you the truth, always, even when truth felt uncomfortable or complicated," Damien said, his voice carrying genuine conviction. "I would acknowledge you publicly, not hide our connection behind careful diplomatic distance the way I did 3 years ago. I would consult you as a genuine partner in decisions that affect both our lives, rather than making unilateral choices and expecting you to simply accept them afterward. And when fear arises, because I imagine it sometimes will, I would name that fear directly, rather than letting it drive me towards silence or avoidance." Elena felt something loosen slightly in her chest at the specificity of his answer, appreciating that he had clearly given the question serious thought, rather than offering empty reassurance. "And if I choose Kellen instead?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. "If I decide that 3 years of silence, however genuinely you've come to regret it, simply cost too much for me to risk building a future with you?" Damien's expression carried visible pain at the question, though he answered without hesitation. "Then I'll accept that choice, however difficult it proves for me personally," he said. "You deserve happiness, Elena, whether that happiness includes me or not. I won't pretend I wouldn't be devastated by that outcome, but I also won't try to manipulate you toward a different choice through guilt or pressure. You've earned the right to choose freely, based on what genuinely serves your own life and happiness, not based on my feelings about the outcome." The conversation continued for a while longer, Elena asking increasingly specific questions about practical matters, how their relationship would function given his position as alpha, how he envisioned balancing pack leadership responsibilities with genuine partnership, what safeguards might exist against the kind of retreat into duty that had characterized his behavior 3 years earlier. Damien answered each question with careful, thoughtful honesty, occasionally admitting uncertainty rather than offering false confidence simply to secure her favor. By the time their conversation concluded, the autumn sun beginning to set behind the eastern gardens, Elena found herself genuinely moved by the depth and sincerity of Damien's responses, recognizing in them the kind of real, hard-won growth that Prescott had encouraged her to look for, rather than simply convenient words offered under pressure of losing her to someone else. "I need one more day to think," she said finally, rising from the stone bench as the light began to fade. "I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." and for Kellen as well. I owe you both clarity, and I intend to provide it. Take whatever time you need, Damien said, rising alongside her. Whatever you decide, Elena. I'm grateful you gave me the chance to answer honestly, rather than simply assuming the worst about my capacity for genuine change. Elena nodded, offering him a small, genuine smile, before turning to walk home through the gathering dusk, her mind working through everything she had learned during their conversation, weighing it against her feelings for Kellen, against Prescott's wisdom about choosing from strength rather than old patterns of validation seeking, against everything she had built and learned about herself these past several transformative weeks. That night, alone in her cottage, Elena sat by her window for hours, watching the stars emerge one by one across the darkening sky, allowing herself to fully sit with the weight of the decision ahead. She thought about the 3 years of silence that had once defined her relationship with Damien, about the genuine pain and diminishment she had experienced during that long period of unrequited hope. She thought about the independent strength she had built these past several weeks, the healing housework that had given her genuine purpose, the friendship with Mara that had sustained her through every difficult moment, the confidence she had discovered in herself that no longer depended on anyone else's attention or acknowledgement. She thought about Kellen, about his consistent kindness, his genuine partnership, the ease and equality that had characterized their entire courtship from its very beginning. A life with Kellen would mean genuine partnership, built on solid foundation rather than painful history, offering stability and mutual respect, without the complicated weight of 3 years of hurt, requiring ongoing healing and rebuilding of trust. And she thought about Damien, about the specific, thoughtful answers he had offered that afternoon, about the genuine growth Holloway and Lady Corinne had both witnessed in him these past several weeks, about the undeniable resonance that had existed between them since that very first meeting, however much pain had followed in its wake. A life with Damien would mean navigating complicated history, rebuilding trust that had been damaged over 3 long years, accepting the ongoing challenge of a partnership complicated by his position as alpha and everything that position required of him. But it would also mean choosing the bond that had first called to her with such undeniable certainty, choosing the possibility of finally receiving the acknowledgement and partnership she had once hoped for so desperately, now offered not out of fear of losing her, but out of genuine, examined understanding of what he had nearly lost through years of avoidance. By the time dawn broke over the territory, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Elena had finally reached clarity, not through sudden inspiration, but through the careful, deliberate process of honest self-reflection she had spent these past several weeks learning to trust. She knew what she needed to do, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the decision felt entirely her own, chosen freely rather than fallen into through old hope or lingering fear. Elena sought out Kellen first, finding him at the guest quarters reserved for visiting delegates, his belongings already partially packed in preparation for his delegation's departure within the coming days. He greeted her with the same warm smile that had characterized their entire courtship, though something in her expression must have signaled the nature of her visit, because his smile faltered slightly as she approached. "You've reached a decision," he said, not quite a question, though his tone carried genuine uncertainty about what that decision might be. "I have," Elena said, choosing to be direct rather than delaying the difficult conversation any longer than necessary. "Kellen, these past several weeks with you have meant more to me than I can easily express. You showed me what genuine, equal partnership could look like, treated me with a consistency and respect I hadn't experienced before, and I will always be grateful for what you offered me during a time when I genuinely needed exactly that kind of steady, uncomplicated care." Kellen's expression carried visible understanding even before she continued, the particular quality of someone who had sensed the direction of the conversation before its full arrival. "But you've chosen Damien," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious disappointment underlying his words. "I have," Elena confirmed, meeting his eyes directly, refusing to soften the truth, even though she recognized the pain it would cause him. "I know that's difficult to hear, especially given everything you've offered me these past weeks. I want you to know it's not a reflection of anything lacking in what we shared together. It's simply that some bond exists between myself and Damien that I can't fully explain through logic alone. A bond that existed since our very first meeting 3 years ago, however much pain followed in its wake. I've spent considerable time these past days examining my own feelings honestly, and I believe choosing him now reflects genuine strength and clarity, not old patterns of hope reasserting themselves. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, processing her words with visible effort at grace, despite his evident disappointment. "I appreciate your honesty," he said finally. "It would have been easier for you to simply avoid this conversation, let me leave Silverpine without ever knowing clearly where I stood. I respect that you chose directness instead, even though the directness cost me something in this moment." "You deserve honesty," Elena said. "You've given me nothing but honesty throughout our entire courtship. It would be a betrayal of everything you offered me to respond with anything less now." Kellen nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile eventually returning to his expression, despite the obvious complexity of his feelings. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope your choice brings you the happiness you deserve, Elena. I meant everything I told you these past weeks, that I found you genuinely interesting, genuinely worth pursuing, but I also recognize that genuine care sometimes means accepting when someone's path leads elsewhere, even when that acceptance carries real difficulty." They spoke for a while longer, working through the natural awkwardness of the conversation, with the same honest, respectful communication that had characterized their entire relationship, eventually reaching a place of genuine, if bittersweet, mutual respect. Elena left the guest quarters that afternoon with a clear conscience, grateful for Kellen's grace, even as she recognized the real disappointment underlying his outward composure. She found Damien in his study within the stone hall, reviewing pack business with the same focused discipline that had defined his leadership for years, though something in his posture suggested restless distraction rather than genuine concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression carrying immediate, visible hope, tempered by careful uncertainty about what her visit might mean. "Elena," he said, rising from behind his desk, "I wasn't expecting you." "I told you I'd have an answer by today," Elena said, closing the study door behind her, granting them the privacy this particular conversation required. "I've spoken with Kellen. I've made my decision." Damien's expression carried visible tension as he waited for her to continue, clearly bracing himself for whatever news she had come to deliver. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the obvious effort required to maintain that steadiness. "I've chosen you," Elena said simply, watching relief and joy flood across his features before she continued, wanting to be clear about the terms of her decision, rather than letting him assume it came without conditions. "But Damien, I need you to understand something clearly before we move forward. This isn't the old dynamic returning, where I wait quietly for your attention and accept whatever you're willing to offer. I've spent these past several weeks building genuine independent strength, and I intend to bring that strength into whatever we build together. I expect the honesty, the acknowledgement, the genuine partnership you promised yesterday. If those promises prove empty, if old patterns of retreat and avoidance resurface, I won't simply endure it silently the way I did for 3 years. I'll walk away, and this time, I won't look back." Damien crossed the study to stand before her, his expression carrying genuine, humbled understanding of exactly what she was offering him, and exactly what she required in return. "And I promise you, Elena, I intend to honor every word I offered yesterday. Not because I fear losing you again, though that fear certainly exists, but because these past several weeks have taught me the genuine cost of choosing silence over honesty. I don't ever want to pay that cost again." "Then let's begin properly," Elena said, offering him a small, genuine smile, despite the seriousness of everything that had passed between them. No more hiding, no more careful distance in crowded rooms, no more 3 years of silence disguised as duty. Damien reached for her hand, and Elena allowed him to take it, the simple contact carrying a weight and significance that 3 years of careful avoidance had never permitted between them. "No more hiding," he agreed. "I want the entire pack to know, Elena, publicly and clearly, exactly what you mean to me. Starting with the next pack dance, if you're willing to attend one again." Elena considered this, recognizing the symbolic significance of returning to the very gatherings she had deliberately stopped attending, this time not as someone hoping quietly for acknowledgement from the corner of the room, but as someone standing openly beside the alpha, as an acknowledged, genuine partner. "I'd like that," she said finally, "though I want it understood clearly, Damien, that I'm not returning to those dances as the same woman who used to stand in corners, hoping for your attention. I'm returning as someone who built an entire independent life during your silence. Someone who chose you freely, rather than simply falling back into old patterns because you finally decided to notice me. I understand that difference, Damien said, his expression carrying genuine respect for the distinction she was drawing. And honestly, Elena, I think it's precisely because you've become that woman, someone with genuine independent strength and clarity, that I finally found the courage to overcome my own fear. I'm not choosing the woman who waited patiently in corners for 3 years. I'm choosing the woman who stopped waiting, who built something remarkable in my absence, who taught me through her own strength exactly what I nearly lost through my own cowardice. The following weeks brought significant changes to the rhythm of pack life in Silverpine territory. Damien made good on his promise, publicly acknowledging his bond with Elena during the next pack gathering, standing beside her rather than across the crowded hall, introducing her formally to visiting dignitaries and pack elders alike as his chosen mate, rather than allowing their connection to remain the subject of careful, unspoken speculation. Elena continued her work at the healing house alongside Prescott, refusing to abandon the purpose and independence she had built during her weeks of deliberate distance from pack social life, and Damien supported this choice fully, recognizing that her continued growth and independent identity strengthened rather than threatened whatever partnership they were building together. Their relationship developed gradually, built on the honest communication and genuine partnership Damien had promised, tested repeatedly through the ordinary challenges of pack leadership and daily life, but never again retreating into the silence and avoidance that had characterized their first 3 years of connection. Holloway watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, occasionally offering gentle wisdom when either Elena or Damien encountered the inevitable difficulties of building genuine partnership after such complicated history. Lady Corinne welcomed Elena warmly into the family, pleased that her son had finally learned the lesson his own father had once required years to learn. Mara remained Elena's steady, honest friend throughout the transition, celebrating her happiness while continuing to hold her accountable to the genuine strength and independence she had worked so hard to build. At the following spring's pack dance, nearly 6 months after Elena had first decided to stop attending such gatherings, she stood beside Damien near the very fire pit, where he had once spent 3 years carefully avoiding her gaze. This time, his attention remained fully on her throughout the entire evening, his hand resting easily at her waist, his laughter genuine and unguarded as they spoke together with pack members, who approached to offer their congratulations on the recent announcement of their engagement. Elena caught her own reflection briefly in a nearby window, and found herself struck by how different she looked from the woman who had once stood anxiously in corners, hoping desperately for acknowledgement that never came. She looked, she realized, like someone who had finally found genuine partnership, not because she had waited patiently enough for someone to notice her, but because she had built enough independent strength to walk away entirely, and only then discovered that walking away had opened the door to something far more genuine than anything 3 years of quiet hope had ever offered her. The story of the alpha who had ignored her for 3 years and the woman who had finally stopped waiting became something of a quiet legend throughout Silverpine territory in the years that followed, told not as a cautionary tale about patience rewarded, but as a genuine lesson about the transformative power of choosing oneself first, and discovering, only then, what real partnership could actually look like.